Welcome to Capital Outsider, a show about people and ideas outside the halls of power, exploring alternatives to conventional political wisdom. Hi, welcome to Capital Outsider. Our guest tonight is Dr. Mitch Earleywine. He's an associate professor of psychology at SUNY Albany. He's also an author. His most recent book, A Parent's Guide to Marijuana, recently came out. He's also the author of Understanding Marijuana and the editor of Pot Politics, Marijuana and the Costs of Prohibition. Mitch, tell us a little bit about yourself to start out with. Just what brought you to where you are?
It's great to be on Capital Outsider, and I'm a professor of psychology since 1991. Back in the early 90s, I was on the faculty at University of Southern California, and I was teaching a class on drugs and human behavior. I had been an alcohol researcher up till then, and thought the students would be really interested in that. It turned out all the students were interested in was marijuana. I had thought I had known that literature, but in fact really didn't, and went through it all and realized we'd not exactly learned the absolute facts when I was in junior high and various drug prevention programs. That actually inspired this book, Understanding Marijuana. I wrote that and immediately thought, okay, I've taken a really even-handed, objective view of this literature. I was suddenly contacted by a number of drug policy reform groups and quickly vilified by the Office of National Drug Control Policy and realized I must be onto something. After that, I went ahead and asked a whole bunch of folks from a whole bunch of different areas, economics, religion, sociology, art, law, philosophy, to all contribute chapters to this book, Pot Politics, and they essentially came up with really pretty much the same conclusions I had, that the legal repercussions of the drug war are really hurting us more than helping us. Finally, after that, Michael Kennedy at Trans High Corporation called me up and said, hey, why don't we do something to help parents explain to kids that they shouldn't smoke marijuana, even though we don't think the laws are right. And I said, I'd be happy to do that, and that's how Parents Guide got started.
Cool. So you didn't come to this topic from an ideological standpoint as a libertarian, or and you don't have to tell us your...
Sure. No, it turned out I really thought I had known this literature, and things I had learned in high school, college, and graduate school were really out of whack from what the research actually said. And so it was more as a scientist and somebody who just wants to make sure people really understand research. And then once that grabbed on, it was kind of hard to stand idly by while we're doing things that are basically morally wrong in the name of incorrect understandings of science.
Now, this your latest book just came out. It's released today. Is that
That's correct.
Yeah. Tell us about this book and what brought you to it. You did mention that you were contacted by
Sure, Michael Kennedy at Trans High Corporation. They're the publishers of High Times.
Oh, okay.
And I thought, wow, this is going to be a curious meeting. And he said, listen, we really need to have an authority explain why kids shouldn't use marijuana, but we don't want to hear the lies. And I said, oh, Michael, I'd be very happy to help with that. And we just sort of walked through things together. There really isn't any amotivation. There really isn't a gateway theory. Marijuana certainly doesn't cause aggression. Marijuana isn't guaranteed to cause even marijuana dependence. So what do we do? And then I walked through some of the data on teen brain development, on the impact on IQ if you start smoking marijuana regularly too early in life, and basically laid it out in a way where there's a discussion happening in the book so people can read it and really enjoy it instead of one of my Oxford Press highly academic books. And you can see it's markedly briefer, and it's more dialogue and a lot more fun to read.
Yeah, I did read it, and I thought it was well done and very easy for average Joe to understand. My kids are past that age, and actually I'm kind of proud of myself. I think I followed your advice without having heard it from you, but we sort of came to it, I think, maybe by ourselves over time. And I do admit to having inhaled once or twice. Actually, that's one of the big... I'm not sure if it's a misunderstanding or not, or if it's true. Is one of the sayings from my generation, probably yours, is if you remember the '60s, you weren't there.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
And marijuana's effect on memory is probably one of the most common? Is it a myth, or you know?
Sure. It turns out during intoxication, it's really hard to learn new material. But remote memory, memories that you've already formed, aren't harmed. So you're still going to remember your phone number. You're still going to remember your first grade teacher's name if you know it when you're not high. And those things aren't at all affected. However, if you have to suddenly learn a big, long list of words during intoxication, you're not going to do as well as you would if you weren't high at the time. However, as soon as you come back down, there really isn't any chronic effect on memory. So occasionally they'll find a big study with a whole lot of people and some complicated memory tests. There'll be a real small deficit in the chronic users. And often those are the studies where I feel like they ask people to come to the lab not high, but these are people who get high every single day. So I'm not convinced they weren't high when they took the test.
Mm-hmm. Well, so long-term memory isn't affected, but you do mention about other effects on the brain, especially of younger people.
Absolutely. It turns out if you start getting high, particularly every day, really early in life, anytime before age 18, we see some really definite changes not only in brain function and the way your brain actually works, but even in brain structure and what kind of cells are growing in the brain. And that's the kind of thing that I feel like is worth making sure everybody understands and often motivates kids if you tell them that and you haven't told them a bunch of lies about amotivation or gateway or aggression. It turns out some of the tests of how the brain works are kind of obscure, but the bottom line is it doesn't work as efficiently. You can still get to the right answer, but it takes a different kind of effort for the brain. And these structural changes aren't giant holes in your head or dead brain cells so much as the proportion of white and gray matter, which is an important proportion for how efficiently your brain works, seems to get out of whack for people who start using early in life. And that's really the message I want to send to kids. But then they say, well, what does that really mean? How does that translate to something? We finally have longitudinal data from a researcher in Ottawa who studied kids across 8 years, gave an IQ test, took the ones who smoked a lot and the ones who didn't, and did see an IQ drop of around 5 points in folks who, before age 18, started using 5, 6, 7 days a week. And it's a disheartening thing to see anybody lose IQ points. We could all use as much intelligence as we can have.
I agree. And those effects are permanent?
It looks like it's not as permanent as you might fear. So that same researcher had a group who had quit marijuana for at least 3 months and found that their IQs were starting to return back to the IQ average for the folks who had never smoked. I don't want to lull kids into some kind of false sense of security, but I do think that it's not the be-all and end-all, and if you have started using early in life, taking that time off can really, really help.
Okay. So there are some real dangers to smoking marijuana. But what are some of the lies that we're told or have been told or we're telling our kids today?
It's so funny because they still come out even today, and it really hurts our credibility with teens when we say these kinds of things. So the ones that I hear most often are gateway, amotivation, and this new marijuana is more potent than it's ever been idea. Mm-hmm. The gateway idea was essentially that marijuana is somehow going to drive you to desire other drugs the way salty food makes you thirsty or something like that. And there certainly are folks who use hard drugs who say, yes, I used marijuana first, but we never hear about literally tens of millions of Americans who tried marijuana who'd never even seen hard drugs. There's also, in big treatment samples, a large proportion of folks who actually tried hard drugs before they tried marijuana. So Blaise Temple has an article about a treatment sample of crack users who basically, because they lived in crack neighborhoods, ended up using crack before marijuana. My favorite example is often Allen Ginsberg, who shot heroin before marijuana and said, well, heroin is the gateway drug. Uh-huh. Of course, that's clearly not the case. The amotivation stuff, which was something that they hit really heavy when I was in junior high, was that somehow smoking marijuana was going to turn you into this apathetic slug, right?
And they've actually done that again recently on commercials I've seen.
It's been spooky how this, what's old is new again, shall we say. Data from my lab suggests that folks who use marijuana even daily have some of the same goals and motivations and attachment to achievement that folks who've never used have. But also when you look at things like grades, interest in extracurricular activities, and plans to go to graduate school or things along those lines, they're either the same, or at least in one study, the pot users are more likely to want to go to graduate school, which I thought was kind of intriguing. They obviously don't know what grad school is like.
On the gateway topic, I admitted to inhaling already, so I might as well, I've ingested and snorted and done, a lot of different things.
That was part of growing up when we did.
In my life. And so, whether pot was a gateway or not, I'm not sure, but I guess what made me stop doing those things was just I had other things to do. I sort of grew out of it, I think. And when I talked to friends of mine who shared my experiences when we were younger, I'm just surprised to find how many of them really seem to be afraid of marijuana, even though their own experience was pretty benign. It's hard to understand. It's hard to understand what they're
I'm afraid some of it is this new potency propaganda. So we hear things about the new marijuana is 100 times stronger than the marijuana of the 1970s. Well, obviously that would be impossible just mathematically. That would mean it was all THC and nothing else. It does look like there's been maybe a doubling in potency over the years, but the tacit assumption is that somehow that's more dangerous. In fact, what we're finding is people get just as high as they always have, but they smoke less. Well, then, in fact, your risk for some respiratory problems is probably better under those circumstances because you're exposed to less of the smoke. And then this idea that parents are more afraid now than they were back when they were doing it, I think is just part of being a parent. If I think about riding a bike or, God forbid, doing gymnastics or swimming, I'm much more worked up about my own kids doing it than I ever was when I was doing it too. And I feel like in some ways it's only natural. But let's make sure we tell the truth to our kids about the dangers. And sometimes we just have to share the fact that the reason we don't want them to do it is because we're a little neurotic. My daughter will say, but why can't I do it? And I say, because your mom and I are crazy.
Well, actually, my wife is an emergency room nurse. So our kids grew up at dinner conversation about all kinds of nasty problems and accidents people had under, usually alcohol, but also we told the kids, we were pretty honest with them about our own youthful indiscretions and basically said, look, the luck is all gone. Our family luck is gone. You got no more. Don't take any chances. So
in fact, that's pretty much what I recommend in the book is if you listen to them and tell them the truth, you can't go wrong. And I feel like the key is not, wagging your finger and saying terrible things are going to happen, but saying, look, here's what the research really says. By the way, tell me what you think. Tell me what you've heard. And when you dispute some of those myths to them, suddenly they think you're really the man, right? If I talk to teens and say, by the way, this amotivation is really just a crock, suddenly they're much more willing to listen to me when I say, by the way, these IQ data are for real. And then they start scratching their heads and being much more intrigued. And you brought up another interesting point, and that's that alcohol and actually tobacco as well actually lead to a lot more negative consequences than cannabis. But again, we don't want folks to start using them early in life just for standard health reasons. And so I think kids will often follow that same argument.
What about the effects of just smoking? I mean, I was a cross-country runner. We smoked some, but I mean, that probably also prevented me from smoking, a lot because of the fear of, damaging my lungs.
Sure.
Are there real effects?
The respiratory symptoms for tobacco are really well established, and the risk for lung cancer is certainly there. And in fact, you make an interesting point, is that when you're interested in a sport or you've got an alternative activity, it's an amazing buffer against drug problems. Once you've got something else you like to do better, of course that goes down. With cannabis, we're not seeing the lung cancer data show up. So Don Tashkin has been following a sample in Los Angeles for at least 10 years now and finding that there aren't elevated rates of lung cancer. There are these increases in respiratory symptoms, though, coughing and wheezing and sort of bronchitis type symptoms. There's a new gizmo that's been developed to help for this, at least in adult users, and that's the vaporizer. A vaporizer will heat cannabis so that a mist will come off, but it never actually ignites the plant, and so there isn't any fire, there isn't any smoke. This fine mist comes up this tube, and then people can inhale that and use that without any of these respiratory symptoms. And actually, my laboratory is looking at trying to get people to use those more and more often, and we're showing some improvement in the coughing and the wheezing, as well as in some of those measures of lung volume and respiratory function.
Talk about the DARE programs and the programs like that a little bit. When my kids were in school, we had DARE. Now, I don't know if it still exists or because I believe in your book you mentioned that it's been pretty well proven to not have been very effective at all.
Yeah, there's a new DARE program, but the data we have so far are pretty much on the old DARE program. And I think what happened was it was a good idea, and it got a little askew, and then we expected it to do more than it really could. So they have 10-year follow-up data saying people who were in the DARE program 10 years later, how are they? Well, what a surprise, 10 years later, they're no different from the folks who had never had it. And in one study, it was a little disheartening because the folks who'd had the DARE program, the only positive effect was they liked members of law enforcement more, and a subset of folks who were from sort of the richer schools were actually more likely to say they wanted to try drugs. And that's clearly not the goal we wanted to have. When the DARE program was first proposed, though, it was supposed to be some hip, older high school student coming into the junior high to explain these things. Mm-hmm. Law enforcement got a hold of this and said, we want to do this, which I think is a nice gesture and a wonderful thing, but that kind of changed the flavor of it a little bit, and suddenly we didn't get the outcomes we had anticipated. And now I even go to schools sometimes and say, you guys know the DARE program doesn't work. And they say, yeah, but the police officers love it, and we just love to have a good relationship with them.
Right, because it's nice having them there for other
absolutely,
reasons.
Yeah.
Now, are you actually invited to schools?
I have been invited to a couple of private schools, and I do love that kind of work, and I'm spreading the word more and more. As you can imagine, because I'm not a police officer, people are a little suspicious at first. I think as I do this more and more, people will be more open to the idea. And I'm really giving the same message that folks really want to hear. It's really about a relationship, about listening to your kids on this topic, and it kind of lays the groundwork for any other topic that might be difficult, sex, alcohol, other problematic behaviors. And I'm really saying teens shouldn't smoke pot. And I think that people can certainly resonate with that message. Mm-hmm. However, my message is not, oh, by the way, you're going to die, because the data just don't support that. And I think some people are a little apprehensive that maybe I'm going to deceive the kids in some way. But so far, at least, they've been really receptive.
Even in this area?
Not in this area.
Okay.
But I'm open to it.
I guess one of the things that probably scares parents is the fact that kids are driving a lot more. I live out in the country where I grew up in the city where I could walk or ride my bicycle or even take the bus places. But now we live out in the country. A lot of people do the suburbs or urban sprawl, and our kids drove every place once they could. And what are the issues there?
It's funny because that literature is kind of controversial, and at least in studies where people are actually driving with a driving instructor next to them who can rate how they're doing, marijuana doesn't show a lot of impairment because people tend to compensate. So where people seem to go awry if they're driving high is they can't stay in the center of the lane very well, but as far as turning, braking, and things like that, they do well, but they seem to be compensating. They're less likely to speed, they're less likely to try to pass other cars, and they're less likely to have a short space in between them and the car in front of them. They're less likely to tailgate. But this is when somebody else is in the car with them. We really don't know how they would function on their own, and I'm just not a fan of recommending driving impaired at any time.
Absolutely.
There's some wonderful data on how antihistamines can impair driving and how a lot of the opiate meds, the pain medications, can impair driving. I feel like fatigue is another big factor in driving, and so I really recommend, driving is dangerous. Let's make sure we only do that under really optimal circumstances, regardless of whether it's a physical issue or an intoxication issue or even a competence. Some folks just aren't good drivers, and we really need to be careful about them as well.
Right. Legal problems, of course, regardless of the reality of the medical effects or the physical effects of marijuana, the legal consequences are real. And that's something, obviously, that our audience, we have, our libertarian audience at least, is interested in. And, what can we do to change the reality? I mean, obviously, if you're going into a classroom now, you got to say, look, if you get caught with this stuff, here's the consequences. And they can be severe depending on your situation. If you have, more than X amount, or if you have it in smaller containers or those type of things, you could be arrested for sale, which is serious.
Absolutely.
What's the reality now? Are you aware of what's going on in New York State?
Absolutely. The law of the land is the law, and of course, this is a violation if you possess marijuana. New York State is relatively rational in this domain, at least for possession. So if you have less than basically an ounce, it's an offense, but it's not a big serious offense the way it is in, say, the state of Oklahoma. Federal laws against marijuana, however, are still applying throughout, and they are more severe even for amounts of an ounce or less. They're on the books, but they aren't enforced all that often, which creates a real problem for me as well as lots of libertarians, I'm sure. I think the key here is that teens need to understand that they're actually overrepresented in the arrest data. So an investigator down at Queens College has shown that teens and folks of ethnic minorities get arrested markedly more than white guys who are over 21. Oh. And it's a shame that that's the truth and that should be a rationale for not possessing, but it really is a genuine issue as far as arrests are concerned. Even folks who don't understand the libertarian argument that we should all be in charge of our own bodies might buy the idea put forth by a philosopher and lawyer named Doug Husak that essentially we want to have a society where the punishment fits the crime. A crime that causes harm to other people, by all means, that should have a real severe punishment. A crime that really doesn't cause harm to other people, I'm not exactly sure why that's a crime. Mm-hmm. So, of course, murder has a worse penalty than double parking. What would the penalty be for possessing a plant? Clearly, it's not causing harm to another person. How could we actually say it's in society's best interest to punish a citizen under those circumstances?
Well, first you have to convince everyone that it's not causing harm. I mean, that's, people have been raised to think, it's going to turn my kid into a slug, and it's, there's a lot of fear out there.
I agree, and I certainly see that that's the case. As it turns out, it's not causing harm to another person, right? It's certainly not going to cause harm to anyone else in our crew, even if it might cause harm to an individual who's using, and that's, of course, a central tenet in the libertarian argument. But in fact, I would argue that the data on the harm it causes to individuals is actually really minimal as well. And
we just need to get that message out.
In fact, just spreading that word is really important. If folks want to check out the Marijuana Policy Project, I'm on their executive board. The National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML, I'm also on their board. And I feel like those groups are really behind getting these laws changed in a way that I think is consistent with some of the libertarian ideals. They don't always take the big step to legalization that I think most libertarians would argue for.
On that issue, there's really two things. Libertarians think that people are responsible for themselves and their bodies, and don't believe the government should be telling us what to eat or drink or smoke or whatever. Do you agree with that point of view, or do you see marijuana as a special case of drug, or either for moral or for practical purposes?
In truth, I'm just not a fan of anybody telling anybody else what to do. As it turns out, as long as, again, you're not harming another person, why can't you do whatever you want? And that's so intuitive to us that it's hard to explain this to other people. And it's curious when I'm in the South or in the Bible Belt or around folks who are really into certain sanctions that ought to be part of the law rather than part of just their own moral or religious background, it's hard for them to understand that, in fact, this idea is consistent with what they really want. They want people to be free. They want people to choose the right path on their own, not have it enforced through some kind of crazy punishment. And I feel like the consequences of having these punishments is actually greater than we often realize. So the drug war is an outrageous expense, as I'm sure you understand, and in fact decreases our respect for the law and increases our expenses in ways that are just insane. It also sends these odd messages to people about what is and isn't their own private life and the business of other citizens.
Understood. One of the issues is where do you attack these issues? Should it be at the state level like California has tried, or does it have to be at the federal level? I mean, California's had some success, at least with medical marijuana, but even that's under attack. So do we need to put all our efforts into a federal change in the law? Or
I mean, I'm starting to feel like maybe all politics is local, and that, in fact, as individual cities have started to pass ordinances saying, we want our police department to make marijuana possession offenses the lowest priority. Seattle and a few other towns have passed these kind of laws, and the law enforcement officers actually seem to be behind it. It saves them a lot of time. You don't have to go down and fingerprint somebody who happened to have a bag of grass. Mm-hmm. I find that those may spread out to the state level, and Marijuana Policy Project has really been pushing some of the medical marijuana and decriminalization bills in a number of states around here now. 12 states in the U.S. have medical marijuana laws that I think are consistent with some of these ideas. And then gradually, as individual states fall, I think it'll become obvious that the federal laws can change as well. This is a real third rail for anybody who's running for public office, but I think as state initiatives get passed and nobody has to run on the idea that I'm going to legalize marijuana, we get an opportunity to look at a taxed and regulated market consistent with the free market we all know and love that could really generate some wonderful revenue for this country and fund some of the very things people claim they want to have as far as drug treatment is around.
Yeah, it's a tough issue. In my past, actually, I kind of led some of my political campaign. I tried getting actually endorsement from the Republican Party and led with a drug reform platform, and they really didn't.
They don't hear that one.
They didn't go for that at all. But it has to be said. It has to be, in whatever the forum is. I know we're going to be both at the Albany Law School, Health Law Forum, which is interesting.
I'm looking forward to that.
Coming up next month, so that'll be neat. One of the things was just on the news yesterday was the passing of William Buckley, who was a longtime supporter of legalizing marijuana and medical marijuana. He wrote a really moving essay on a guy that died while waiting sentencing, and whose name escapes him right now. But he was
Peter McWilliams, I think.
Peter McWilliams,
yes.
That's it. Yeah, really very interesting. A person who was
a splendid libertarian. I mean,
yeah, and dying of some sort of cancer, I believe, and ended up because he couldn't. He was going to be sentenced, and during while he was awaiting sentencing, he had to not take marijuana for his nausea, and ended up vomiting and choking on his vomit. So
I actually wrote a letter to the judge who was sentencing Peter to try to get him some kind of home sort of sentence, if you will, and it turned out that didn't happen. As you can imagine, the medical marijuana arguments get very heated, but the one that came up around that was that Peter was supposed to use Marinol, the synthetic THC in a pill, and of course the guy is nauseated and vomiting. How's he going to hold the pill down? It was really a rough situation for him to put in, and it's a real tragedy that somebody who had medicine right there had to die under these circumstances.
Yeah. So we need to definitely work towards some more rational laws, and that's something hopefully our local Libertarian Party will work on in the state. And Bill has given me the sign that we're just about done. Mitch, I really appreciate you coming tonight. And parents, please take a look at your local bookstore, or is it on Amazon?
It is on Amazon today.
Parents Guide to Marijuana by Mitch Earleywine. Recommend it to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on the show.
See you next time.